It was the winter of 1996 when I found myself driving through a snowstorm in rural New Hampshire. I was heading back home after visiting a friend in Vermont, but the storm had come in fast and heavy, turning the highway into a blur of white. The radio crackled warnings of road closures and plummeting temperatures, but the nearest town was miles away, and the snow was piling up too quickly for me to make it. I needed to find shelter, and fast. I spotted the small motel purely by chance, a flickering neon sign barely visible through the swirling snow. Mountain View Inn, it read, though the only view I could see was the endless stretch of white. The building was old, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades, but it was a roof over my head, and that's all that mattered. I pulled into the snow-covered parking lot and trudged to the front office. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, and I was greeted by the musty smell of aged wood and stale air. Behind the counter sat an elderly woman, her silver hair pulled back into a tight bun. She looked up from a dog-eared book, her eyes narrowing as she studied me. "Bad night to be out on the road," she said in a voice that was surprisingly strong for her age. "Tell me about it," I replied, shaking the snow off my coat. "Do you have any rooms available?" She hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "We don't get many visitors this time of year," she said, "but I've got one room left, last one on the left, at the end of the hall." I thanked her, paid for the room, and took the key she handed me. It was an old-fashioned key, not a card, attached to a large, worn leather fob with the number 13 engraved on it. "Enjoy your stay," she added, though there was something in her tone that made the words sound more like a warning than a courtesy. The hallway leading to my room was dimly lit, the only sound the creaking of the floorboards under my boots. The walls were lined with faded floral wallpaper, peeling in some places, and old photographs in dusty frames. The whole place felt like it had been frozen in time, untouched by the decades that had passed since it was built. I reached the door to room 13 and inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a heavy clunk, and the door swung open with a groan. The room was small and simple, with a single bed, a nightstand, and a worn armchair by the window. A thick layer of dust coated everything, and the air was cold and stale, as if the room hadn't been used in years. I shivered, not just from the cold, but from an unsettling feeling that I couldn't quite place. It was like I had walked into a space that wasn't meant to be disturbed, but it was late, and I was exhausted. I closed the door behind me, locking it with a heavy click, and set my bag down on the bed. I tried the lamp on the nightstand, but the bulb flickered and died, leaving me in darkness. I sighed and pulled out my phone, using its light to find my way to the bathroom. The bathroom was just as old and neglected as the rest of the room. The mirror above the sink was foggy and cracked, and the tiles on the floor were chipped and yellowed with age. The only thing that seemed out of place was a small brass key sitting on the edge of the sink. It wasn't the same as the room key. It was smaller, more ornate, with a strange symbol etched into the metal. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. It was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been, and I had no idea what it might unlock. I thought about taking it to the front desk to ask the old woman about it, but something stopped me. Instead, I slipped the key into my pocket and tried not to think about it. I went back to the main room and settled onto the bed, pulling the thin blankets around me. Despite the old radiator hissing in the corner, the room was freezing, and I couldn't stop shivering. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was restless and filled with strange, fragmented dreams. In one of the dreams, I was standing in a long, dark hallway, much like the one outside my room. The walls were lined with doors, all of them closed and locked. As I walked past each one, I heard faint whispers, too soft to make out the words. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the doors endless. Finally, I reached the last door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out into the darkness. I felt a strange compulsion to open it, to see what was on the other side. My hand reached out for the doorknob, but before I could touch it, the door swung open on its own. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark and cold, and for a moment I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I lay there, listening to the silence, and then I heard it. A faint scratching sound, like nails on wood coming from the hallway outside my door. I sat up, holding my breath, straining to hear. The scratching grew louder, closer, as if something was moving down the hallway toward my room. My mind raced, trying to rationalize the noise, a branch against the window, an animal caught in the storm. But deep down, I knew it was something else. The scratching stopped right outside my door. I froze, my eyes locked on the door, half expecting it to swing open at any moment. But it didn't. Instead, the scratching was replaced by a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on the wood. Tap, tap, tap. My pulse quickened, and I slowly slid out of bed, my feet touching the cold floor. I moved toward the door as quietly as I could, my breath fogging in the frigid air. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I reached the door and pressed my ear against it, listening. There was no sound on the other side, no footsteps, no breathing, just that constant tapping. I didn't want to open the door, but I had to know what was causing it. I had to see. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I hesitated, then turned it slowly. The door creaked as it opened, revealing the dark hallway beyond. There was nothing there. No one. Just the long, empty corridor stretching out in both directions. I let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through me, but it was short-lived. I stepped into the hallway, and that's when I saw it. The door to the room across from mine, the last room on the left, was open. A faint light glowed from within, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I knew that room had been locked, just like all the others, but now it was open, inviting. The key in my pocket felt heavier, almost burning against my skin. Without thinking, I pulled it out and looked at it again. The strange symbol etched into the metal seemed to shimmer in the dim light. I knew I shouldn't go in there. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave the motel and never look back. But something drew me toward that room, something I couldn't resist. I crossed the hallway, the cold air biting at my skin, and stood in front of the open door. The room beyond was dark, except for the faint glow coming from a single object in the center, a small, ornate box covered in the same strange symbols as the key. I stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath my weight. The air in the room was even colder than the rest of the motel, and the sense of unease was overwhelming. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to see what was inside that box. I knelt down beside it, my breath catching in my throat. The box was old, the wood polished to a deep, rich shine, and the symbols carved into it seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. My hand shook as I lifted the lid, revealing the contents inside. It was empty. For a moment I stared at the empty box, confusion and fear mingling in my mind. But then I noticed something strange. The shadows on the walls were moving, shifting, as if alive. I looked up and my blood ran cold. The shadows were no longer just shadows. They were figures, dark and twisted, writhing and reaching out toward me. Their faces were featureless, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the walls. I jumped to my feet, dropping the box, and tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows crept closer, their whispers filling the air, growing louder, more frantic. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but no sound came out. The shadows were all around me now, their cold hands brushing against my skin, pulling me down, down into the darkness. And then everything went black. I woke up in the snow, the pale morning light filtering through the trees. My car was parked nearby, half buried in snow, but there was no sign of the motel. The road stretched out before me, empty and untouched. I stumbled to my feet,